Well, good afternoon and welcome to another edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation weekly live stream. As you know, if you've tuned in since we started this in March, we tend to cover timely policy issues facing the United States. And I think, as our three guests will emphasize today, there is no more pressing and timely issue facing the United States today than appreciating the principles behind the US Constitution. We say this not just because later this week on September 17th, we will celebrate Constitution Day, but we say it because 2020, among all of its other obvious challenges, has been a year when the Constitution and the principles and values that informed it have come under not implicit, but explicit attack. And so what we decided to do at the foundation is, as we often do, have an honest conversation about it. And the way we frame this is to accept one of the criticisms, at least for matters of discussion, that some of the critics of America have said, decrying that the United States remains in 2020 to be a republic built on slavery. Well, what role did the Constitution play in that? Alternatively, and I think you'll probably hear a heavy dose of this from our guests, we might also explore what Frederick Douglass called the Constitution, which was a glorious liberty document. So whether you are a passerby interested in policy, whether you're someone deeply interested in the history of this country, or perhaps you're a teacher, either someone who teaches other people's kids, or perhaps a homeschool teacher, we want this hour to be a great resource for you. And not only in terms of content and substance, but also in terms of style. I think one of the things that we're lacking as a republic in the 21st century is the ability to have an honest, candid, civil discourse about pressing issues facing us today. And so, knowing our three panelists well, having the privilege of working directly with two of them each day, I know that you are in for a treat. And so let me introduce them. First of all, I'm Kevin Roberts. I have the privilege of serving as director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I am based in Austin, Texas, where my two colleagues are, but I'm on the road today. I heard there was a hurricane in the Gulf Coast, so I wanted to get close. So thanks to our wonderful think tank friends at the Pelican Institute based here in New Orleans who are allowing me to use their space. They had a live stream in this room earlier today, so I guess this is just the day for talking about pressing issues from uptown New Orleans. Joining us from Irving, Texas, from the wonderful, very promising college, University of Dallas, is Dr. Susan Hansen, who's Associate Professor of History and Department Chair there. My two colleagues, very finely dressed as they always are Dr. Tom Lindsay, who is our scholar for higher education. He has often been, depending upon how we've structured TPPF, our scholar on the Constitution and the early Republic. He is joined by one of our newer colleagues, Dr. Richard Johnson, who heads up our Booker T. Washington initiative. And I should say, Dr. Johnson, as we'll get into a little bit, is also a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. And as we celebrate Constitution Day, my friend, thank you for your service. So, Susan, this is Texas, so ladies first. And as we often do before we get into some specific questions, we sort of want to frame the conversation. And we're going to assume, by virtue of people tuning into this either live or on a recorded basis, that they're interested in the question, what are the origins of the current attacks on the Constitution and the American Republic?
So, as you said, I teach at the University of Dallas, and I've been invited to many different places to speak about Constitution Day. And I've never been to a better Constitution Day celebration than the ones that we have at the University of Dallas, because they're really quite raucous. A lot of our faculty have big families, and they bring all the kids. There's a lot of marching around with flags. There is, a lot of alumni coming back, a celebratory speech. And the students really get into the singing aspect of it. So it's a celebratory day. But I think that that's very unusual, right? To speak to your question, that's very unusual on a college campus these days, right? Places like the University of Dallas, which actually, celebrate the Constitution, are unusual in higher ed. And really that goes back to long before I was even born. So in 1968, there were race riots all across the United States of America, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Atlanta. And simultaneously, students took to the sidewalks and hallways of their universities chanting, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go, and burning American flags. They were partly protesting the Vietnam War. Partly it was the time of the sexual revolution. And also, universities had been very much infiltrated by the Communist International and the KGB, as is evident from the opening up of the KGB archives. One really doesn't know much about the history of the 20th century if one is not aware that American higher education and American media and Hollywood has been very much affected by Marxist ideology through the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and definitely through today. So it really is no surprise that this anti-Americanism has now become part of public culture, because it's been part of the culture of American higher education and critical theory, which is just a code word for Marxism, in almost all of the humanities disciplines. I remember when I was a graduate student, whether you were talking about Lady Macbeth or you were talking about Keats' poem on autumn, you were actually just looking for a Marxist subtext, right? This was really all about the oppressed and the oppressor. Whether you were talking about trampling the grapes in the harvest of autumn with John Keats, right? Or whether you were looking at prostitution in Victorian London, or whether you were looking at planter culture on Southern plantations, right? It didn't really matter what the topic was, whether it was in literature with Shakespeare, or whether it was about poetry, or whether it was about politics or economics. It was always colored with the framework of Marxism. So this has been what state universities and Ivy League universities and private school liberal arts colleges have been feeding our students for the past 50 years. So anyone who is surprised at riots, or surprised at looting, or surprised at Black Lives Matter, surprised at anti-Americanism, surprised at an attack on the American founding as conceived in liberty, really hasn't been paying much attention to what's been going on in higher education for the past 50 years.
Well, that is as thorough an indictment of the origins of the attacks on the Constitution and the Republic as I've heard recently. So thanks for getting us started in a strong way, Dr. Hanson. So Dr. Tom Lindsay, you've spent your career really not just studying the Constitution and the political philosophy around the founding of this country, but you've been a really important leader, including in policy, in restoring civics education, history education. And so I'm curious, just to answer or ask the first devil's advocate question. Let's say there's someone in the audience who says, well, okay, the Constitution's being attacked, the Republic's being attacked, it's been over 200 years. Why should I care? How would you respond?
I would tell them they should care only to the extent that they care about themselves and their children and their grandchildren living in freedom and prosperity. Because let's get down to the bottom line here. If these attacks that on the American regime that we're hearing, the New York Times 1619 Project, the Obama administration's new civics curriculum, the action civics movement that's going around K-12 in the country, if they prevail, then America as founded is really dead. And Dr. Hanson stated it very well. Back in the 60s, we abandoned core curriculum. We abandoned the study of Western civilization. We abandoned the required study of American history in college. And in its place, we put the unholy trinity of race, class, and gender. Now, when I say unholy trinity, I simply mean this. When the Declaration of Independence says that all human beings are created equal, what it means is it doesn't deny all of our differences, but what it says is that what we share in common far outweighs what separates us. But the new doctrine of race, class, and gender teaches that we are forever separated on the basis of accidents of birth. And so therefore, the consequence of this teaching, and unfortunately we're seeing it in the streets right now, with greater separatism comes greater misunderstanding, and with greater misunderstanding comes hostility, and with hostility, violence. So sad to say, but these principles have had their consequences. We're living through them right now. So I would say every American who cares about the fate of this country needs to care about this issue.
That's well said, and it's a perfect segue to our response from our colleague and friend Richard Johnson. Richard, obviously, before you came to TVPF, for people who don't know, you were very active as a policy leader in the Texas legislature and municipalities. You're an educator, a social worker. I mean, your bio is as long on its own as it is combined for your three fellow panelists today. My question for you is, you and I've spent a lot of time as friends talking about how people can be different race, they be different religion, obviously different sex, have different perspectives about things. But what strikes me about you, and of course millions of African Americans, is that in spite of a very difficult history in several chapters of this country's history of segregation and racism, you and I would posit, tell me if I'm wrong, a majority of African Americans are very proud to be here and very proud of the document. And I just, obviously, you answer that however you would like, but I know that many members of our audience are specifically interested in your perspective about the Constitution and Constitution Day.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm a freedom fighter, and that's how you and myself and Tom, we got together because we're fighting for freedom. And it's no surprise that those who are adversaries of freedom would attack the Constitution, because the Constitution since 1787 has been our sword for freedom. And let me tell you the reason why I say that. You know, most folks look at what the Constitution says and look at it as a steel document, but it is a living document. And through the providence of God, those framers were able to create a document that would be able to be utilized in generations going forward as they gave birth to a young nation. And we see it time and time again. We saw Abraham Lincoln take a look at the Constitution and pull it out. And Abraham Lincoln said the Constitution did not address or substantiate man as property. And when he took that fight on, Frederick Douglass picked it up and carried it on to the stump in the streets, and then educated people that man could not be property. And even though Tanner and Dred Scott had made a decision that man is property, he had misinterpreted the Constitution, and it took a young, brilliant Abraham Lincoln to go in his speech at Cooper's Union and just obliterate Dred Scott, and then come forward in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, 1865, ratifying the 13th Amendment, which was 78 years after the document was voted on and passed to be the Constitution of these United States. But then we go forward into the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 99 years later, it would take a young Martin Luther King to pick up that same sword and say, hey, wait a minute, here's our sword of freedom. Here's our contract with not only America, but with humanity, and win that battle. So here we are now, 56 years after MLK and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And we're seeing again that document, that sword of freedom, being tested. And that's why I'm so confident today that it will withstand anything that comes up against it, because since 1787 to this day has been 233 years and standing as a standard bearer of freedom. And those of us who are freedom fighters will always go back to the Constitution and pick up that sword and stand for freedom. I love it. It's great. It's great to be in America today. It's great to be in America from 1787 forward. But it took those framers in the provident wisdom of God to look forward as they were building a new nation and create a document that would stand up against tyranny, that would stand up against anything that challenged our independence as human beings. For the people, by the people, That is the United States Constitution of the
Man,
people.
I wish I were there with you to give you a high five. That's
Yes.
fantastic. And you've cued us well. And I'm going to come back to a couple of things you mentioned, but being the historian, I just have to move chronologically, as Tom knows oh so well. Tom, of course, can just deal in the abstract so well. And so, Tom, I'm going to come to you, and then Dr. Hansen, back to you to move chronologically. Tom, I know we're celebrating the Constitution, but it's also really important, as you have implored thousands of students and adults in your career, to remember the Declaration of Independence. And so talk to us about the importance of the Declaration inherently, but also how it informed the wonderful experiment that we're still living, which is this constitutional republic.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. Well, and I'm simply following Abraham Lincoln, right? And Lincoln was right. You cannot understand the Constitution if you don't understand the Declaration. Our audience, it might be helped by thinking of the Declaration as the spirit and the Constitution as the flesh. The Declaration gives us the American theory of justice, the four self-evident truths: that all human beings are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with unalienable rights, that government, to be legitimate, must be based on consent, and then finally, that it's the right and the duty of the people, if government becomes destructive of the ends for which it's been instituted, to overthrow and abolish the government. So when we talk about the Declaration, we need to understand that the Declaration we read today is not the original Declaration. Thomas Jefferson wrote a first draft that he submitted to the Continental Congress. And what Jefferson did, it's very interesting. I think folks are all familiar with the long train of abuses that are listed in the latter part of the Declaration. And of course, they build up. Meaning, as any lawyer knows, if you're making charges against someone, you don't start out by saying they killed, they kidnapped, and oh, by the way, they jaywalked, right? You start with the least and you go to the worst. Well, the last charge in Jefferson's original declaration, meaning the worst charge, he says that King George III has imported men, and he puts men in capital letters. If anyone has any question about whether African Americans were included under men in the Declaration of Independence, you just simply need to look at Jefferson's first draft. Well, why isn't that in the final draft of the Declaration? Answer: because half of the colonies at the time had slaves. So then we could say, well, we should have stood by principle and said, well, then you're not going to be part of the new union. Okay, how likely would we have won the Revolutionary War fighting with one arm behind our back against Britain, the greatest power in the world at the time, right? How many slaves would have been freed if we had lost? 0. Now, again, this is just a simple fact that students used to be taught. I mean, that's what I want our audience to know. We don't need to run away from our history. We just simply need to study it, find out what really happened, and to see that Frederick Douglass was right. Both the Declaration and the Constitution are glorious liberty documents.
We have a tendency, to that point about people hating America, Tom, to be skeptical of things we don't know. And so while there are many examples of great Americans, historical figures, whose statues and other memorials have been assailed, probably the one that bothers me the most is when it happens to statues of George Washington. And Dr. Hansen, I just want to invite you to comment on that specifically, but also, as Dr. Lindsay did, maybe give us a brief history lesson about the importance of Washington himself, as well as the founding generation.
Right. So what we're seeing in college students today is that they don't know the documents, right? I'm very grateful to Richard Johnson for saying we should look at the Cooper Union Address, right? Which very clearly shows, right, that Lincoln knew that the Constitution never referred to the African slaves as property, right? It refers to them as persons held to servitude, right? It refers to their personhood, right? So people have not read Lincoln, right? They haven't read Lincoln's Cooper Union Address, right? And I would highly recommend that one. They haven't read his Peoria Address, right? Which gives a history of the United States with relation to slavery. It's a very important pocket history, right? Which gives a history of the United States with regard to slavery. They don't know the Gettysburg Address. They don't know the Constitution. and they don't know the Declaration of Independence, right? Students indiscriminately refer to lines like the laws of nature and nature's God, or we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, as lines coming from the Gettysburg Address or coming from the Constitution. Or they will think that we the people, right, comes from the Declaration of Independence, right? They simply do not know the texts by the time they are 18 years old and capable of voting, right? They have not been taught the texts of the founding, right? When we get to the figure of George Washington, right, it's interesting because George Washington is often thought of, he's not the pen of the revolution, right? He's the sword of the revolution, right? So we don't really think of George Washington's name when we think of the texts, right? When we think of the Declaration of Independence, you don't think of George Washington as the author of the Declaration of Independence. When we think of the Constitution, George Washington is the great silent presider over the Constitutional Convention, right? But we don't think of him as the pen of the Constitution, right? We do have George Washington's 3 farewells, right? His farewell as general, his farewell as President of the United States of America, but his 3rd farewell, which people really need to know, right? His most famous farewell is his last will and testament. George Washington was the only American founder who owned slaves and freed his slaves, right? John Adams, for example, amazing American founder, never owned a slave. Right? Alexander Hamilton, American founder, right? Joined an abolitionist society. Right? Benjamin Franklin, amazing American founder, right? Objected to slavery. Okay, but look at George Washington, a slaveholder, a large slaveholder from Virginia, a southern plantation. Right? Now, there were various ways in which slavery could have been gotten rid of during the American founding period, right? And all of those ways of getting rid of slavery were explored, right? Could it be done by the Constitution itself? Could it be done by an amendment to the Constitution? Could it be done at the state level? Should it have been done at the state level, right? It was part of state law in southern states, right? The northern states did take care of slavery at the state level, right? John Adams wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, and they abolished slavery, right? Many of the states abolished slavery at the state level. They thought that was the right way for it to be gotten rid of, right? Either through a state Supreme Court decision or through the state legislature, right? Through what they called taxed and reimbursed manumission, which is what Great Britain did, right? Or it could be done at the local community level. Right? And lastly, it could be done by a single slaveholder who would freely free his slaves, right? All of these methods were explored by people both in the North and in the South during the period of the American founding. Jefferson advocated for state level manumission, state level liberation of slaves. They all participated in writing the Northwest Ordinance, which made sure that slavery would never move into the Western territories. And that is the basis of thinking of America as an empire for liberty. And it's very important to Lincoln that we preserved the principle of the Northwest Ordinance, right, which did not allow slavery to move west. We preserved that principle in the Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850, which is why George Washington believed that one could be patriotic for America because it was an empire for liberty. Right? He only became very angry when that was disrupted by the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. Right? And he thought that was a destruction of the fabric of an empire for liberty in 1854. But until then, he thought we had been living in a government which was fundamentally committed to the gradual ending of slavery and liberation of the slaves. For that generation who believed that that was America's purpose, right? For that generation, they looked to George Washington, right? They looked to George Washington as a man of monumental virtue. So monumental was his virtue that they built the largest obelisk on planet Earth to George Washington, right? This was an obelisk, a monument to George Washington, right, which celebrated the fact that without a Supreme Court decision, without the Constitution, without a law that said that he had to, he freely freed his slaves. Right? Now, people say, why did he free them at his death? Why didn't he free them sooner? Because George Washington did not think, this is a very difficult point to wrap your head around, right? George Washington did not think that by freeing his slaves and leaving them destitute, freeing his slaves and leaving them in poverty, or as they said in the 18th century, casting them upon the public purse, right? Casting them on social welfare, that was real liberation. For George Washington, you were not politically free unless you were also economically free. Freedom was rooted in property. And so George Washington worked his whole life to get himself out of debt so that in his will, he could give freedom and the property to sustain that freedom to his own slaves, right? So that they could be genuine free men capable of supporting their family with their property, tithing to support their church with their property, and being taxed for the public defense with their property. That's what freedom meant to George Washington. Freedom meant having enough property to be able to fulfill your obligations to God, Father, and country. If you only had freedom, but you were living on the public purse, if you only had freedom, but you were destitute, if you only had freedom and you were living on social welfare, right, you were not truly free. And so George Washington worked his whole life to achieve what he considered was the best form of liberation for the slaves that he felt responsible for. Right? This was a monumental achievement, and it is what is celebrated in the Washington Monument, the largest obelisk on planet Earth as we spin around the sun as a planet.
Well, I'm chuckling for many reasons, Dr. Hansen. One of them is our audience got that wonderful history lesson for free. And so thank you very much. And I really appreciate the comment you
All
made.
Donations to the University of Dallas are welcome.
Yeah, I was cueing you. I was cueing you. So I really like the comment that Washington understood that in order to be politically free, we also had to be economically free. And I mean it not pejoratively or to pick fun, at least not much, but for younger Americans who are really vulnerable to the misperceptions that are being promoted by the Marxists and neo-Marxists, they may want to take that to heart. And if they get this message, to do some reading that y'all have already suggested. And I think that if they're thoughtful and intellectually honest, they might come to really understand that. And that's really a good point, Richard, for you to come back into the conversation with, because I think there are two 19th century Americans who, more than any others, really are the bridges between Washington and the founders and the modern era, especially Martin Luther King. And they would be someone you've already mentioned in Abraham Lincoln, but also Frederick Douglass. I'm curious if you might tell us a little bit more about Frederick Douglass. And the follow-up question is going to be about that other great American, Booker T. Washington, after whom the project that you run is named. And so it's a great opportunity for you to bring us up to almost the modern era where we might talk about some solutions to these problems.
Absolutely. And I love Frederick Douglass simply because Frederick Douglass was born a slave and actually taught himself how to read and write, and then became an abolitionist and one of the best speakers and orators of his day, and then went on to be an advisor to Lincoln. And Frederick Douglass admired President Abraham Lincoln. And I think the two men had a mutual admiration of each other, simply because when Frederick Douglass was able to talk with Lincoln about allowing African Americans to serve in the Union Army, the question then was, this experiment, would they fight against slave owners, or would they turn and run, or would there be some psychological issues that would impact them? And Frederick Douglass and Lincoln together came forward with the Fighting 54th Infantry of Massachusetts. And the experiment was, most people think that most of the Fighting 54th were former slaves, but actually they were not. The larger majority of the Fighting 54th were free Black men who basically joined the Union Army to help carry this flag of liberty and win, and help with the mindset of winning the war and the mindset of freedom and freeing all the slaves. Now, Frederick Douglass wanted to actually be in the Fighting 54. He wanted to go into the Union Army, but President Lincoln said, no, you're too valuable to,
Yes.
to the mission. He said, well, if I can't go, then I'll send my son. And so you had this kind of relationship, this kind of thing. And this was just, based on the idea of freedom. It wasn't black, white, brown, yellow. It was based on the idea of freedom. And men of America standing up together to fight for freedom. And Lincoln in his wisdom and his ability to articulate the Constitution was able not only to inspire African Americans, but he inspired the majority of the nation. And Lincoln was faced with something that was incredibly challenging. You think about a civil war. Who wins in a civil war? These are cousins fighting cousins. These are relatives fighting relatives over an idea. But that is what gives us confidence even in this day. The idea of right and the providence of God is so powerful that it doesn't matter how difficult the challenge that comes up against it. Martin Luther King said, the moral arm of the universe is long, but it always bends toward justice. You see, sometimes it goes the long way around, but it always comes back to God's providence and the law of nature. And I like that because, see, when you go back and you look at John Locke and you look at Blackstone, Jefferson and the framers got a lot of their wisdom from Locke and Blackstone in terms of the laws of nature. When man's law must line up with God's law. And when it gets when it conflicts against God's law, at the end of the day, who always wins out? We know that. And so basically you got Jefferson down, and we go back in this era, stand in this era with Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And then you get another young man who comes up from slavery, Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington comes up from slavery and he's like, hey, wait a minute, young man who was born in slavery, walked miles just to get a little bit of education, and then becomes a free man, but then believes in education because why? We have to have an educated workforce. Now, the thing that Booker T. Washington believed in, I love so much, is not only, he never talked against learning how to be a poet or liberal arts and sciences, but he also said you were going to know how to lay a foundation, and you were going to know how to build a house, and you were going to know how to do farming, you were going to know how to feed yourself. There's nothing wrong with being a poet, but know how to build a house also.
They're not mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah. But Booker T. Washington then comes up and is tapped to lead Tuskegee. And most people don't know this that I talk to right now. The richest and the wealthiest historically Black university in America is Tuskegee. Why? Tuskegee owns over 5,000 acres of land. you see, and it's not, I mean, Howard has a nice endowment.
Yes.
You know, Morehouse has a nice endowment. Spelman has a nice endowment, but Tuskegee has 5,000 acres of land. And see, that makes a huge difference in the conversation. So these men all inspired Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
When Martin comes along, Dr. King looks, he says, wait a minute. Here's where we fight the fight, right here. Here's the promise and the contract with America. Here's the promissory note, he called it. Here's the promissory note. All we have to do is make America do good on the promissory note, you see, which is the Constitution.
That is so well said. And to sort of come full circle back to Dr. Hanson's articulate summary of Washington's magnanimity, the virtue of virtues, we might say that the headline that all of you would write thinking about these historical figures is that while of course the United States was and is flawed, it's a human enterprise after all, the Constitution gives us the means by which to redress some of those problems and to address some of those problems. And I mentioned often in a recent public comment the importance of every American, regardless of where we're from, regardless of our skin color, regardless of our religion, of rereading Martin Luther King's 1963 speech repeatedly each year, especially if you're feeling low about what's going on in 2020, if you're feeling low about politics or policy or sort of intentional divisiveness, to home in on King's eloquent phrase about being judged by the content of our character rather than the color of our skin is completely what the Constitution is about. So I could talk to the three of you for a couple hours, and that would be really greedy on my part because we have this wonderful audience who's already wanting to ask some questions. I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll get to audience questions. And that one question is, what are the solutions? So Tom, I'll start with you. You might start with policy. Obviously, you and Richard work in that day to day, but I'm curious, what are one or two solutions that our audience members might research or might get involved in?
Well, Richard and I have both been working to try to strengthen civic education in Texas K-12, and we will continue to pursue that with the upcoming session. But concerned Americans shouldn't wait on the legislature. There are things you can do right now. You can go to your school board meetings. You can follow the State Board of Education as it chooses curriculum and textbooks. Well, I can tell you something that I did coming back. I was up in Dallas yesterday. On my way back last night, I listened a 2-hour YouTube presentation where they have a professional reader read the chapter from Thomas Sowell's book. The chapter is called The Real History of Slavery. That 2-hour YouTube presentation will tell you everything that you need to know. And you can use that, you parents out there that are homeschooling your kids, you teachers among our audience. It's just a wonderful, if you don't know about Thomas Sowell and his work, then I'm glad you're listening to this presentation because you will find him to be a rich resource.
Thank you. Dr. Hanson, what would you suggest?
I would just add to that, vote with your money. Vote with your money. Vote school choice with your money, right? If you can, pay for your own children's education, right? At a school that you are involved in as a parent, involved in those curricular choices, involved in the hiring of teachers, right? Vote for school choice. There is an amazing revival of education going on at the K through 12 level in terms of the charter school movement, right? Vote for school choice. The best thing that you can do for African Americans in the inner cities, right? Stuck with this education, for immigrants, right? Who come to this country wanting freedom and prosperity and not even knowing that their children are being indoctrinated at the public schools where they're sending them for free. Right? Sponsor an immigrant child to go to a better school than their local middle school. Right? Vote with your money. Be a philanthropist. Endow a chair of Western civilization. endow a chair of American civilization at a university that will accept that money, right? Make sure that you're involved in the hiring of the first person for that chair, right? Somebody who has patriotism, right? Who understands that this is a nation under God, right? Or sponsor a trip for your local school or your local church. Sponsor a field trip to Washington, D.C. And if anybody wants to hire me to be the tour guide of choice, I will fly out to Washington, D.C. and meet you there, right? Anytime. So we will look and we will see exactly what Richard Johnson said, right? He said that this is a promissory note. The Washington Monument is a promissory note. That's the words on the page, right? And that Washington Monument reflects in the reflecting pond, pointing towards the completion in deed in the Lincoln Memorial and the Emancipation Proclamation, right? There is a relationship between those two monuments on our mall in Washington, D.C., right? The relationship between word and deed, promise and fulfillment, right? And we have been working as a nation on fulfilling our promises. We have not fulfilled all of them, but we are working on it as a nation, right? As any man who promises I do to taking care of his wife in sickness and in health, and only 30 years later when she has cancer discovers what those deeds would actually have to look like, right? Word and deed, right? As a nation, we gave our word, all men are created equal. And we are working on it as a nation together, right? We should be patriotic towards that project. And from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, right? From the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in this same sacred space of our country, Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, right? This space between the Washington Monument and the founding, the Lincoln Memorial and the Emancipation Proclamation, and Martin Luther King's famous address, right? I Have a Dream, right? Should be a patriotic space for all Americans. If you and your school and your church have not yet been on a road trip, right, across this empire for liberty, right, then sponsor that road trip.
Very, very well said. So, Richard Johnson, what would you add to that list of ways we can begin to solve this problem about the Constitution or understanding the Constitution?
Well, I think they pretty much covered it, but I'll try to add something. I'll try to add a little bit in there. A wise man once said that my people perish for the lack of knowledge. And I believe that we can educate our way out of a lot of our problems. A lot of our responses to things are done out of ignorance. That means just being unaware and not getting the real education. Dr. Carter G. Woodson wrote a book, The Miseducation of the Negro. You know, there's a lot of miseducating going on. And then because of miseducation, you have what? Faulty responses. And people going down the wrong road. So we need to have good education, a good education system. And Tom and I fight this fight all the time, you know, because we believe that we can educate our way out of it. We get the right education into the right places to the right people. And then I'm an old soldier. I'm a military guy. I served in the United States Army. I would recommend, you know, service to all young men and women. And I'm gonna tell you the reason why. You know, when I decided to sign up and volunteer for the United States Army, folks said, well, look, man, you're gonna go over there and you're gonna die. And I said to myself, that's a possibility. That's a real possibility. And then I thought about it, I said, well, a lot of these guys are already dying right around here in the neighborhood. So at least if I die, you know, I'll die for a noble and worthy cause, and that's the United States of America. And so I was really happy to make that choice. And I've recommended to all young men in my family and young women. My niece was in the Marine Corps, so I mean, I've recommended to all of them. Look, join the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and it'll give you a great experience. And for many of our young folks growing up in the inner city, it'll create a pathway to receiving more education. Mm-hmm. And those sorts of things, not just the education in, you know, academic education, but traveling, and you see the world, you meet people from different walks of life. and you come together on a common goal. And I think that helps us because, you know, when you're in the foxhole, you don't care what color the person is. We're both aiming that way. You're not shooting inside of the foxhole. So if I could recommend anything to young people would be to experience the United States service, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and also to hold close to a very good education. And Tom and I'll keep fighting to enhance civic education, history, in our K through 12 and also in higher ed. We're pushing it all over the place. But we're going to keep fighting for that. And as other folks come on and join this fight, we, you know, like Dr. Hansen said, we gain the right momentum. And there is a momentum out there right now for school choice, parental freedom. We believe in freedom all the way around the board. We don't believe that people ought to be locked into a failing school, which we call a creation of infrastructure for the school to prison pipeline. If you should not, just because you don't have money, you should not have to send your kid to a school where you know that 90% of the folks there are failing and 70% of them are going into the criminal justice system. Because in the state of Texas, even though we don't pay income tax, but there is sales tax. So if you go out and buy a loaf of bread, you are putting into the sales tax into the till. So it doesn't matter how poor you are, how rich you are, those dollars ought to follow the child and allow the parents to have the freedom to make the selection that best suited for their children.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the first questions that's been posed by our audience is about how we enact change in the public school system. And I think you, Richard Johnson and Susan Hansen, have answered that well with your imploring our audience to get behind school choice. And I would say, if you're skeptical about that, or you say, I happen to believe that we need to really invest in public schools, I would say, if that's the case, then invest your time in paying attention to the curriculum that many of these school boards and your state board of education are implementing. One of the silver linings, it's ironic and tragic, of remote education in our K through 12 public schools during COVID has been for parents of public school children to see with their own eyes and hear with their own ears the absurd, if not immoral, aspects of some of the curricula in public schools in this country. And I think we're really undergoing an awakening of American parents. I would encourage you to harness that energy, harness that momentum into real change. And if you're a public school teacher, obviously this is nothing but a pro-teacher message, because we want to honor and respect the sacrifice you're making for this country. And we know you care deeply about this country. We want to be sure that the reason you're showing up for work each day is not for the perpetuation of a system, but for the fulfillment of human flourishing of every one of the young souls in your care. And so I really appreciate, Richard and Susan, what y'all have said there. So let me get to a couple of other questions from the audience, and then I'll ask y'all to wrap up as we get close to the top of the hour. Tom Lindsay, this one's coming to you. You and I talk about this a lot. We're just a couple doors down from one another, which you may lament on a daily basis because of my frequent questions for you. But one of the things we've talked about, and this audience member is very curious about it, is, are riots sometimes necessary to implement change?
If you live in a tyranny, then some sort of action against the existing government, be it civil disobedience or be it rioting, could, yes, in fact, be necessary. But the question is, do we live in a tyranny or not? Or instead, do we live in a representative democracy where change can come slowly because of the democratic process, but it comes legitimately, and it comes without a civil war, and it comes without all the collateral damage that comes with a war? So no, I would say, generally speaking, you don't. If you reach the point where rioting is regarded as the last alternative, then you had better be able to make a good case that you actually live in a tyranny. And, you know, Abraham Lincoln warned about the spirit of, and this, he gave a speech at the age of 28 in 1838. He gave a speech in which he warned that if we lose what he called reverence for the Constitution and laws, that we would decline into what he called mobocratic rule. And I think that if Lincoln were alive today, viewing what's happening in some of the cities that we've been watching, sadly, this summer, that's exactly what he would call it.
Sure.
And you know, as someone who has studied the French Revolution in addition to the American Revolution, I can't help but feel after witnessing what's going on this summer, this might have been what it felt like to live in Paris during the French Revolution.
Well, and I suspect our colleague and friend, Dr. Hansen, might say something about intellectual tyranny, which I think those of us who've spent some time in higher ed as conservatives and Christians have not just felt, but we've seen. As Dr. Hansen, feel free to weigh in there, but I was also going to pose to you a question, another question from one of our audience members, which is, how can we as a country restore unity and the United States of America as our founding documents intended?
And so perhaps I can bring both of those questions together, right?
Sure.
Are riots sometimes necessary, and how can we restore unity, right?
Sure.
I think that after teaching Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail for 20 years of my life, year in and year out at the University of Dallas, it's one of our core texts. Every student at the University of Dallas has to read Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, where he makes his argument in favor of civil disobedience, not uncivilized chaos, right? He makes his argument in favor of civil disobedience. And I realize, right, that the generation that came after Martin Luther King rejected that advice and turned to terrorism, turned to bombings and shootings and rioting. But after teaching that text for so many years, I think that Martin Luther King is drawing on a long-standing, right, Judeo-Christian tradition, right, of peaceful protest.
Yes.
That you protest a law or a policy, but you are willing to accept the punishment that comes with the violation of the policy or the law. If you are a Christian and you refuse to worship the gods of the state, worship divine Caesar, you are willing to be burned at the stake in the Colosseum. You are willing to be crucified. You are willing to be fed to the lions. Right? If you object to segregation, right, when you peacefully protest, right, you are willing, like Martin Luther King, to go to jail. If you object to the destruction of children's lives in the womb, you may lay down in front of an abortion clinic's doors. But if you are arrested, right, you sing hymns as you are taken away to prison. Right? Peaceful protest, right, is actually, as Martin Luther King says, it is an appeal to the conscience of those who see you. When you see that figure standing in front of the tanks in Tiananmen Square, and if anyone in our audience doesn't know what I'm talking about, go on YouTube and watch, right, that figure standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square. That is what a protest in conscience looks like, an appeal to conscience, an appeal to the mind and to the heart, right, of your oppressors, to persuade them that what they are doing is wrong, right? That is not an appeal to violence. It is not an appeal to the worst in our nature. It is an appeal to the highest thing in our nature, to our rationality and to our human compassion, right? But when you take to violence, when you take to anarchy and rioting, you destroy the livelihoods of innocent people. You destroy the livelihoods of people who live in immigrant communities, who live in African-American communities, who have been working hard to support their families and to get themselves out of poverty. You do not help the communities that you think you are helping. So I think that Martin Luther King is right on this one. And all we need to do is to read Letter from the Birmingham Jail.
Oh, we ought to. And I wonder, Dr. Hansen, what percentage of anarchists, I hesitate to call them protesters, having experienced some of them around the White House 2 weeks ago, have actually read that. And
Martin Luther King knew how to restore unity. He appealed to our Christian character. Yes. This is still a majority Christian country. African Americans believe in Jesus. African Americans go to church. African Americans rely on prayer. right? African Americans say, you have a blessed day, honey, right? African Americans, right, love God, right? Those of us who also love God and think that this is a country under God, a phrase that comes from George Washington, right? That under God, we will achieve our goals of liberty, justice, equality, and prosperity for all. If those of us who believe that we are still living under the providence of God come together, right, of all races, that's what Martin Luther King managed to achieve. My uncle, who was a Roman Catholic priest, marched down the streets of Chicago, arm in arm with Martin Luther King, right? He joined races, he joined classes, he joined faiths, right? Those who believe in God, Jews, Christians, Muslims, have to come together to defend the family and the country, right?
Well, I really, really appreciate what the three of you have mentioned today. I'm going to pitch the last question to Richard Johnson. And Richard, that is to leave us with some sort of encouragement amid 2020. This has been a challenging year. And I've heard, as I know the three of you have, from members of this audience, from neighbors, from friends, for that matter, people probably disagree with us politically, how challenging and frustrating a year it's been. And I think as a people, as one people, Americans, we sort of owe it to one another to emphasize whatever optimism, whatever encouragement we can have. And Richard, I think you're well positioned today, given your experience, to close us out with that comment.
Well, Kevin, I think we're blessed to be in this moment. You know, Jefferson had his, and the founders had their moment. Lincoln and Frederick Douglass had their moment. Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had their moment. 56 years later, here we are in our moment. Mm-hmm. And the ultimate question lingering on the table, pleading for an answer from man and from Americans. How will we shape this moment? How will we respond to this moment? Will we respond to it as Lincoln referred to the slave masters of the South? He said, you would either rule or ruin, in his Cooper's address. But we would come together and we would move a nation forward. The anarchists of the day that we see in the streets, they will either rule or ruin. I should think not. I think it's the will of good men and good Americans who will come together, unite, understand that we are a growing nation and we're going to have growing pains. And we are slowly rooting out the vestiges of slavery. And I think that we're committed to continue to do that through our education systems, through our policies, and through our political systems. So I'm happy about this moment because this is a time and space in history where we see a lot of change that's causing friction, but the subtle minds will hold together the union and move this nation forward, holding up that one document, our sword of peace and freedom, the Constitution of the United States of America.
Dr. Richard Johnson, Dr. Tom Lindsay, Dr. Susan Hansen, I'd like to stand up and give you a supreme ovation for everything that you've said today. I think it's gonna be very helpful for not just members of our audience, but people out there who haven't had the opportunity to tune in. And so let me say thank you, you three, for your time today. I wanna thank our members of our audience as always. As Richard would remind us, this is our moment. And one of the things that we have to do is never concede the public square to people who would rather divide than unite. And I think it's very important physically, literally, not to concede the public square, but also figuratively. Part of the public square is social media. Part of the public square is letters to editors of newspapers, comment sections on websites. It's really important that each of us take a couple of steps this week as we celebrate Constitution Day and not only read more or reread things that we haven't read in many years, but to actually get out and proclaim the beauty that is the US Constitution and the American Republic. We will, at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, give you a list of all of the resources our panelists have mentioned today. Go to texaspolicy.com/constitution, and you'll find them there. I'll also submit to you that now is the time to forget supporting institutions that actually are enemies of this unity. And I would submit to you that, of course, in addition to TPPF, that you consider the University of Dallas, which I happen to think is one of the great hopes for the future of America, not just honoring the past, not just being good in the present, but for the future of America. And it's those institutions and some like it that really do need our investment of time and resources. So again, Tom, Richard, Susan, thank you so much. May God bless you, continue to prosper the work of your hands. And of course, may he continue to bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless America.
Thank you.